It falls to me to try and tidy things up, and I'd just like to go back by starting off and saying we are here because of the Lancet Neurology Commission, and it's brought together a lot of information, a lot of people, and a lot of knowledge. This is the list of various recommendations in the infographic, which has been handed out, and it's available on the Lancet Neurology website. And it consists of 3 sets of recommendations. The first is how to apply existing knowledge to improve prevention and clinical care. The second is to develop a common language for epidemiology and benchmarking of care. And the third is to advance knowledge, clinical care, and outcomes from research. The first is pretty much sorted out by the talks you've heard so far. And a little bit of what's there in the second item has been covered by the speakers who've come before me. However, in advancing knowledge for clinical care and outcomes, the focus of how we go about this, what is the blueprint to go from this point forwards, is something that's worth talking about for just a few minutes. All of these focus on things like improving precision of therapy, multidimensional outcomes, comparative effectiveness research, increased risk of later neurological disease, and global collaborations. Why are these important? Because they stop dealing with patients as groups of patients and realize that they're individuals. Very importantly, they also make us realize that healthcare systems are not the same the world over, and what is the right answer for a patient in a given context may be very different in another context. The purpose of precision medicine, as this encapsulates, was first enunciated by the National Research Council in the US, and more recently, the Personalized Medicine Conference, which was run by the European Union last year. And just to think about why we're talking about precision medicine, because some of our partners in other parts of healthcare may not quite understand what we are saying. Precision medicine targets specific treatments to patients or patient subsets, and the assumption is that they have a specific biology which is responsible for the disease, their disease mechanism, and hence are more likely to benefit from treatment. That's important because none of our treatments are risk-free, and we want to pick out patients for whom the benefit is maximum. But this implies that there are mechanistic differences in diseases, that the molecules that cause diseases are different from one patient to another. And this applies really well to cancer because each tumor is not just different from other tumors, but it's genetically different from the host. But the TBI insult, regardless of whether you run into by someone on a football field, if you're hit over the head by a bar, or you have a road traffic accident, is a physical insult. It doesn't have different molecular characteristics. It's better characterized by really categorizing the injury type and severity with imaging and biomarkers, as Jeff just showed you, but also the host response in terms of the genotype and biomarkers. So there are variations from person to person, but not the same way that you see for cancer. And this variation will allow us to select treatments and their intensity very precisely. But to understand how to do this, we need large patient samples with detailed data to develop rational disease subsets, and such data sets need global collaboration. As one of Graham Teasdale's papers said before, when we set up EBIC, no one knows enough alone, and to do this, we have INTBER, which is the International Traumatic Brain Injury Research Initiative, which is a global and growing consortium of funding agencies and studies which involve over 350 centers and 50,000 patients of all TBI severities, which is supported by the various funding organizations, the European Union, the National Institutes of Health, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, OneMind, the Ontario Brain Institute, and the Department of Defense in the US. We're really happy that now this map includes contributions from China and India, but unhappy that so far we haven't had, though we are trying now, to include contributions from Africa, because this is where the 90-10 difference operates. Now, so much for collecting the data. We're collecting the data across a broad range of geography, and we'll continue to broaden that geography. But how about sharing that data? Most funders now require data sharing, but what does that mean? So in a recent paper, Wilkinson in Scientific Data suggested that we should use the FAIR acronym. It needs to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. findable is pretty self-evident, accessible is interoperable, is allowing anyone who sees the data to use it for their analysis, and reusable so that there are community standards. But very importantly, these opportunities also come with requirements for support. There needs to be attribution and recognition. Those of our contributors to CENTER-TBI and TRACK-TBI who are not primarily on the research teams are still making an enormous effort to collect data, and their effort needs to be recognized. And finally, costs of creation and maintenance of these databases is not negligible. So about 5 years ago, this paper from the regulators, this is from the European Medicines Agency, the French, the UK, and the Dutch regulatory agencies, looked at open clinical trial data for all, a view from the regulators. What are the pros? Well, self-evidently, if it's publicly funded data collection, it should be available for public use. It will allow confirmatory analyses of study results. Pulling all of these things together provides a statistical power which makes questions that are previously completely impossible now possible to answer. It allows development of predictive and prognostic models saying, how are patients going to do so we can stratify them for treatment, and allows people to build new analysis tools. And when we have all of this, we can take our individual patient and map it on to this large database to find out which group of patients it most matches and which treatments we should use. But there are some cons. There's real difficulties, and I've extended some of their points for TBI research. There are real difficulties in uniform data collection in acute emergency situations. Protection of patient identity and data is an issue. Multiple analyses runs the risk of statistical penalties. It's possible that we may disincentivize people collecting data because people who have very large outfits just to analyze data maybe undertake predatory data analysis. As soon as data becomes available, they get to analyze it and get published very high priority papers. And the cost of data curation and access really hasn't been taken into account by many of the funding agencies. The ADNI collaboration suggested that this was as much as 15%. So for our CENTER-TBI study, which was 30 million euros, that would have meant an extra 4.5 million euros just for data curation, for data sharing. Now, I'm going to just mention two of these in some detail because they're specific for TBI. The first is TBI research is not an average day at the office. And this slide brings together pictures that I've got from so many of my collaborators, including Jeff, Ari Ercole, and others. If you're doing dementia research, you make a note in the diary that you're going to bring your patient back on a given date. But our story in patient starts here with the patient upside down in the truck that had an accident. They then arrive in the emergency department, and you're trying to do research at the same time as you're trying to save lives. They get to the intensive care unit where suddenly we are overloaded with data, both in terms of imaging and in terms of intensive care. And when it comes to looking at outcomes across the world, this is a service delivered to traumatic brain injury by CENTER-TBI, which is a translation of all of the outcome instruments into 22 languages. And it goes beyond then. The conventional 6 or 12-month endpoint for traumatic brain injury outcomes is no longer valid. This is work from our group looking at the loss of white matter progressively, not just from 2 days to 1 week or 6 weeks, but going on from 6 months and 1 year and beyond. So what we have is a huge amount of data, which is multi-episode, multi-modality, multi-sequence, highly variable, and with outcome over decades, which is acquired in really difficult circumstances at the point where it matters. This is challenging, and as a consequence is often incomplete and requires curation. So if we want to do this properly, we've got to bring as much data as we can, not just from studies, but clinical data together as well. But we have a problem trying to bring that data together. This is a Symantec report on the state of privacy in 2015, just 2 years ago. And the question that was asked is, how much do you trust these organizations to keep your data secure? We're doing much better than social media and retailers, but 1/3 of our patients don't believe that we're going to keep their data secure. And this is not for research, this is just for clinical care. They trust government even less, so that's good news for us, I suppose. And then these incentives and drivers have made the regulatory bodies and legislators provide greater protection for data, which is absolutely required. This is the EU General Data Protection Regulation, very similar to HIPAA in the States, which this says 199 days till the GDPR enforcement. It's now 198 days and counting. And this will impose required restraints on us being able to share data so that people's rights are protected. But there's lack of clarity. There's lack of clarity regarding what we do with capacity and consent for research. People have focused a lot on dementia and said, well, you can make a decision now about what happens to your data once you get demented. But what happens when capacity is suddenly lost in a healthy subject? A teenager is not going to make decisions about whether he wants his data shared or not. Genetic data and research, we've run into this problem because actionable information, supposing you detect that a patient has an abnormal genotype that predisposes them to cancer, what do? How do we deal with anonymization and pseudo-anonymization? What is desirable versus what's achievable? How do we share data across jurisdictions? And what do we do about long-term follow-up? The outcomes we're looking at for the linkages to late neurodegenerative disease are 20, 30 years in the future. How do we maintain the databases that allows us to look at this? So I'm coming to my last two slides. This is the Commission infographic, but only a portion of it. There are 12 recommendations, but all of the key recommendations that go from 6 to 12 are critically dependent on global collaboration and data sharing. The Lancet Neurology has really done a huge job in bringing all of these thoughts together. It's promoting open science as a new paradigm of knowledge generation. We have over 300 authors and contributors in this, and this matches the trend of open science across many diseases. And such collaboration and data sharing could address impossible questions. But a cautionary note: to succeed, this new paradigm must address a global view of TBI. We can't just confine ourselves to our borders. 80% of the people who die from traumatic brain injury die beyond the regions where we have all of the facilities that we have. We need to implement the advances that are achieved through research, and David Tovey talked to you about some advances there. And finally, we need regulatory and resource needs that allow us to share data and sustain this effort. So it falls to me finally to say thank you. The first thank you is to our patients, those that participated in the Lancet Neurology Commission and the people who are here, but the wider range of patients who have taught each of the clinicians all that we know. And we're hugely grateful to them, and they are at the core of this endeavor. We have to get this right for them. We have to thank the European Parliament, and particularly Patrizia Toia, who allowed us to have this here. When Andrew and I were talking about this, he was worried about how this would go. And I said, I'm sure it'll go well, but the important thing is not how it goes, but it's happening here, because that is a recognition of where this has reached in its journey to making things better. We're really grateful to Mark Goldhammer, who's now left the Commission, and to Stefan Hogan, who have allowed us and shepherded us through this process of having this function here. Andrew has already said thanks to Elena, Alison, and Rebecca, and I echo that. It's been fantastic working with you. And it's been such a good experience that even though we went through hell, we might do it again for something else. To all our interview partners and co-authors, Andrew and I are really representing a cast of, in this paper, in this commission, hundreds, but really we're drawing on the knowledge and discussions of thousands of collaborators. And finally, in CENTER-TBI, Wada Tahahi and Veronique have really held us together. And I don't know what Andrew would do without them, and I don't know what I would do without Andrew. So thank you all. Thank you very much.